Welcome to your industry study video tutorial. Today we're going to have a look at the first syllabus dot point, which is structural considerations, and we're going to go over a little bit of content that you did in year 11 just as a refresher. So first we're going to look at organisation. That's the first subset or sub-syllabus dot point underneath structural considerations. So businesses can either be government owned or privately owned. An example of a government-owned business is something like Australia Post, whereby which it is owned by the government. An example of a privately owned business is something like IKEA or Apple or some of those other industries that you looked at, industry businesses that you looked at last year. Now, depending on who owns the business depends on how they operate and who they're answerable for. So a government-owned business operates in a slightly different way in terms of transparency and what they're required to do compared to a privately owned business, because technically the government is answerable to the population, so that kind of affects the way in which the business is structured, whereas privately owned is only accountable either to its owners or to its shareholders. So the three main forms of business are sole traders, which is privately owned or one owner, partnership, which we're going to have a look at as well in a little bit more detail, which can be between 2 and 20 people, or a company, which can be either public or private, and we're going to have a look at the difference between public and private companies. So a sole trader is privately owned, and it usually only involves one owner. Now that one owner manages the entirety of the business, and it's a simple organisation with pretty low costs. So examples of sole traders in the industry can be, a bloke that does plumbing or something and it's just him. So he's a sole trader. An example could be someone who freelances for web design and it's just them. They own and they manage the business, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. And because there is only one owner, it usually is associated with pretty low costs. A really big advantage of operating or organising a business as a sole trader is it's easy to form. If it's just one person, it usually has pretty low startup costs. It's pretty simple to run because you're not working with a team of people. The owner is in direct control, and any profits that are made, that goes straight to the owner. And one really good benefit or advantage, is that you can actually trade under your own name. Now, there are some disadvantages, obviously, with just having a sole trade business or being a sole trader. Everything's kind of up to you. There's usually limited resources for growth for your business to grow because it's just you. So even if you get more work in, it's still just you working. And that's where you have to look at, subsets like subcontracting out. It's also the skills base is limited to the owner. So you could be in on a job, and if you're just a sole trader and the particular client wants you to do something else, so if you're in web design and they want you to do animation, or if you're a plumber and they want you to do some other handiwork, it becomes really hard if you're the only person in the business. However, the biggest disadvantage is that there is unlimited liability. Now that's a fancy way of saying in terms of what you're that's in terms of what you're liable for, and it's a fancy way of saying if something goes wrong, so your business can't afford to pay a debt, then the owner becomes totally liable for it. There is unlimited liability, or the owner is totally liable for any costs occurred by the business or as a result of actions of the business. A partnership, like we spoke about before, is between 2 and 20 people. Commonly, there's not usually 20 people, but it's usually a husband or a wife or a father or a son. So say, for example, if we go with the web design example from before for Multi, the husband might be on the web design and, the wife might do database design, or, the husband could be in web design and, the wife might do another part, might work on another part of the business, or a father and son. If we go with that plumbing example, it could be a father and a son partnership. Partnership is a pretty effective way to minimize tax because the business is taxed at each partner separately. And each partner is equally liable for the debts concerned. So it's a bit of a separation of responsibility and a separation in terms of tax brackets. So again, easy to form, low startup costs, but because there is more than one person, you have a broader skills base than a sole trader. There's usually pretty limited outside regulation. So from the government and from the tax office, there's not a lot compared to a company. There is less regulation or less, required of a partnership as opposed to a company. But you can spread the workload. So each partner is taxed individually, and as we were talking about before, with liability, if something goes wrong in the company, it's reduced liability with more than one person because that liability is split in half. In terms of disadvantages, if you're going on a really broad objective level, it's actually divided authority between the partners. So there is usually not one single person necessarily in charge on paper, even though that might be the case in practice. It is tough in terms of if you want to sell that partnership, it's less flexible in transferring ownership. However, each partner is liable for the actions of the other partner in terms of the business. So if anything goes wrong, one of the partners in the partnership goes rogue, each partner is liable for the actions of the others. However, like with a sole trader, there is unlimited liability. So if something goes wrong within that company, and the business accrues a massive cost, the partnership still has to pay out that cost. This will make a bit more sense when we look at companies and we look at limited liability. Okay, so in terms of the organisation of a company, if it's private, it restricts ownership and who can buy shares in that company, whereas a public company is on the stock exchange and you can buy shares in a public company. Yeah, and sorry, the other last thing on company is that it is responsible and accountable to its shareholders. So advantages of a company include limited liability. So the liability of a shareholder, so if something goes wrong with the company, the liability of shareholders is limited to the amount they pay for their shares. So let's dig deep into that. Say you bought $1,000 worth of shares in a company, and that company has a liability cost, so say something goes awry, and they have a $20 million cost that they have to cover. In a sole trade, you would have to pay that $20 million by yourself. In a partnership, if there was two people, that would be $10 million each. However, in a company, if there was a $20 million cost and I only bought $1,000 worth of shares, my liability will be restricted to simply that $1,000. And that's what we call limited liability. So you're only liable for the amount of shares or the amount of ownership that you have in a company. So it's called limited liability. So should anything go wrong, you're only liable for your investment within the company. In terms of a company, some other real positives is that, it's pretty easy to sell ownership if it's share-based and it's a public company, or if it's privately owned shares, it's usually quite easy to sell ownership. Management can be run by a board, who are usually and can be independent of the company. So in terms of who manages the company, it can actually be separate from the workforce. And that can really help manage the organization of the business and, all of that stuff that's almost superfluous to the day-to-day running and the day-to-day practicalities can be managed by independent people and a couple of people within the business. There's huge tax advantages to running a company in terms of the way in which you can tax and negatively gear and offset amounts. And the last one is it's usually easier to attract money and capital because businesses are complex forms of business. So it's usually easier because you have a larger workforce commonly, and it's a lot easier to be able to make and attract capital. In terms of a disadvantage, unlike sole traders and partnerships, the governments usually regulate. There's a lot of regulation around companies, and you usually have a lot of independent watchdogs, we call them, or people that are government organizations and bodies whose sole responsibility is to ensure companies in terms of a business are adhering to legislation. So, there's usually a lot of close regulation by government, and they're not as easy in any way, shape, or form to set up. Another thing to talk about in terms of companies is there's huge startup costs. So it's very expensive to form, and those startup costs are massive. And it was also ongoing and incurring costs in terms of maintaining a company. So companies, yes, more capital, but you also have to have more capital at the start to actually be able to set them up. The second syllabus dot point underneath structural considerations is again a refresher from year 11, and it's management in terms of roles and levels. So last year we looked at the two types of structures for companies, and that is hierarchical and flat. So when you have more than two people, and you in a company, you have a structure in terms of who's responsible for what and who's accountable to whom. Companies have responsibilities to be organized in different ways, and different people at different levels hold different roles and hold different responsibilities. In terms of hierarchical, it's a tree-like structure. So often you have a managing director or CEO, and underneath them are senior managers, underneath them are supervisors, underneath them are workers, and underneath them are support staff. Tree-like structure actually does beyond laying out responsibility. It also has what we call chains of reporting, which is who you're responsible, essentially, who you're responsible and who you report to. So this worker over here, if he had an idea, for it to get up to the managing director or CEO, that worker has to pass it on to his supervisor. That supervisor has to deem it important enough maybe to pass on to a senior manager. And then once that senior manager then again has to go through them, and if they deem it important enough, they can bring it up at a particular meeting or, to his direct line, to their direct boss. Now, some of the time, this is just an example of a hierarchical structure. Above senior managers, you might have another branch, which is upper level management before the managing director, or this is just an example. It's a tree-like structure. So, in this example, this is one of the pathways, but it basically lays out the hierarchy of lines of reporting or management. Flat. So some companies choose to have a flat management structure with less of this middle management, so less of this supervisors and senior management, and just more frontline workers. In smaller organizations, a few staff usually have several roles. So if you're looking at, a small multimedia business, one worker might be responsible for web design and database design if there's only 30 people in the company. Or if it's a handyman or, timber particular job, it might be, someone's in charge of invoicing and, their particular skill set. So that's when we have people in charge of more than one, general area, we call that multi-skilling. And it can be a really effective way to manage tasks, particularly in smaller organizations. And that's it, guys. That is a refresher of organization and management roles and levels underneath structural factors in your industry study.